Okay, so what we want to do in this video is start our inquiry into the theoretical framework behind why the previous video has gone through 9 separate benefits of international trade. What we're going to do is try to prove in, again, a theoretical sense, the benefits, and show by example, that particularly using production possibilities curves, why international trade is beneficial to both countries. Okay, that's what we're trying to do now. Now, I'm going to give the game away before we start. We are talking about absolute advantage, which was the discovery of Adam Smith. Okay, the father of classical economics. And writer of The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So we've looked at the benefits of international trade in a general sense, and now we're going to calculate the benefits of international trade in a hypothetical example. We're going to look at 2 countries, USA and China, each capable of producing 2 separate goods, wheat and cars. But do not forget, we're still dealing with the real world issue. Who are the winners and losers of the integration of world economies? Okay, who are the winners and losers of importing and exporting and foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment? Now, what we are looking at, and there is a reason that I have 2 gentlemen on this slide, okay? We have already said that there are many advantages to international trade, and we've talked about exports and imports. Now, just to be clear in general, how do you decide which country exports and which country imports? The country that can make the good at the lower price exports, and the country that makes the good at the higher price imports. Just in general, that's what we're saying. But what I want you to see is we're looking at, these are the 2 guys when it comes to classical trade theory, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. We're looking at what this guy did, which is Adam Smith, and it's absolute advantage. Okay, Adam is absolute advantage, and David Ricardo is this thing called comparative advantage, right? So what we need to look at now is the building blocks of classical trade theory made by Adam Smith, absolute advantage, which David Ricardo used in order to inform his improved theory of comparative advantage, right? Now, so what we're saying is, essentially what we're trying to get to is understanding this guy's theory of comparative advantage, David Ricardo, but we can't do that unless we first look at Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage. So David Ricardo published his work of comparative advantage in Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817, and I said it's called comparative advantage. But before that, what we're going to look at is Adam Smith's stuff of absolute advantage. Now, this is the definition of absolute advantage, and this is what Adam Smith correctly but incompletely said are the benefits of international trade, are the basis to prove the benefits, more accurately, of international trade. A country has an absolute advantage in the production of a good if it can produce more of it with the same resources, or equivalently if it can produce the same amount using fewer resources compared to another country. Now let's think about that. We always, and I've talked about average cost of production in the last video, and that's really important, particularly when we're talking about economies of scale and productive capacity or productive efficiency. Now, this is insanely important. If you are using less resources to produce one good than firms in another country, you are more efficient at producing that good. That is the good, according to Adam Smith, that your country should specialize in, should essentially stop producing everything else and just produce that. Then how do you get everything else, you may ask? Well, in just producing that, you sell that to the rest of the world. They produce the goods in which they have a comparative advantage, which of course by definition has to be different to yours, and therefore you trade. This is the idea. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to look at the 2 countries. We're talking about absolute advantage done by Adam Smith. There is 2 countries and 2 goods in this model. We are going to compare them. Okay? So, if the USA, right, has one person working one full day, right, and each worker has the same amount of imports, they will produce 40 units per worker per day of wheat, 40 bushels. However, the same worker, no difference in like laziness or effort or anything, right, with the same resources and same time will only produce 20. There are differences in factor endowments, and as such, workers in the US are currently, based on this, better at producing wheat than workers in China. Now, on the other hand, what we've established here is that workers in China are better at producing cars than workers in America. One worker with the same amount of machines, with the same amount of time, the same resources, can produce 50 cars in a time period, whereas one worker in America can only produce 10. Okay, so I want you to understand that. So if we're looking at it doesn't have to be one worker per se, it doesn't have to be one day, it could be the entire population, as long as the numbers are the same. It's how much resources you put into these things, okay? So the above table shows the quantities that one worker on 1 acre of land with one machine in one day can produce in each country. Okay, that's the simplifier. It doesn't technically, if you have an objection, it doesn't technically have to be that much, because no one worker in the world can produce 50 cars in a day. Each worker in each country has the same exact inputs available to them. Okay, this is true if they only produce wheat or produce cars. Which country is best at producing each good? Well, USA is best at producing wheat because 40 is better than 20. And China is best at producing cars because 50 is bigger than 10. Now, what we're going to do is put these on the production possibilities curve. If we're going to talk about something, we might as well know what we're talking about before we speak about it. So a PPC, a production possibilities curve, is a curve showing the maximum combinations of goods or services that can be produced by an economy, or at least in this case by one worker in an economy in a given period of time, if all the resources in the economy are being fully used and efficiently and the state of technology is fixed. Now, we are used to seeing these things in terms of countries. We will again see them in terms of countries in a second, but realize that this shows increasing opportunity cost, whereas we don't need to do that for our ones. Ours are just straight line when it comes to international. So basically what I am saying is this US PPC and this is China's PPC. And don't forget, what we want is their ability, they can produce anywhere along the curve that's known as efficient. Okay, so anywhere along the curve that's efficient. They can produce either 40 units of wheat in a day or 10 cars in a day in America, or 20 units of wheat in a day or 50 units of cars in a day in China. Now, if we put them on the same graph, we should be able to see who is best at producing what. Which country has the absolute advantage in the production of what good? And the answer is America has the absolute advantage in terms of wheat, because one worker with 1 acre of land with one machine for one day can produce 40 bushels, whereas the same exact quantity and quality of resources in China produces 20. Well, at least we'll just say work. I don't want to get overly concerned with the definitions. All we're saying is which workers are more efficient at producing what in which country. And now let's talk about China. Workers are more efficient at producing cars there than in America, because one worker in one day can produce 50, whereas one worker in one day can produce 10 in the United States. Now, again, forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I just want you to see and understand. So if one worker spends all day producing wheat, they can produce 40 bushels of wheat. Or if they spend all day producing cars, they can produce 10 cars. And likewise, if you do the same for China, it's 20 and it's 50. But they can produce anywhere along their PPC. So the idea is they can produce anywhere along these lines. So I think I say in the next one, let's just assume they like a bit of both and they decide to produce half of everything that they produce. They spend half their day producing wheat in both countries and half their day producing cars in both countries. Okay. Now, I've said all of that. I've said that too. Which country has an absolute advantage? As we can see from the table, or from the graph, USA has an absolute advantage of producing wheat because 40 is bigger than 20. So a wheat producer in America is better than a wheat producer in China. And China has an absolute advantage in producing cars. We can see that from the table because 50 is greater than 10, or that the Chinese curve is further to the right in the car axis than the American one. So a Chinese car producer is better than than an American car producer. Okay? Now, yep, I've said all that, forgive me, I was saying too much. So suppose, now we're getting to it, suppose they spend their time producing spend half of each day producing one good. Well, basically this is what you get in America, okay? What you get is USA's production and consumption with no trade, because what we produce we can't consume, and there's no trade, so all we can consume is the maximum what we produce. So it's 20 bushels of wheat and 5 cars. Now the same is also true for China. So let's assume they're going to spend half their time producing wheat and half their time producing cars. So that's 10 bushels of wheat and 25 cars. And China can only consume what it produces, so its standard of living, its ability to consume goods and services depends entirely on its flippin' well production, on its domestic real GDP. Okay, so let's go here for a second. Production and consumption with no trade. America produces 20 units of wheat and 10 bushels of wheat is produced by China, so we add those together, we get 30. America produces 5 cars, half its time, and China produces 25 cars, so we add those together, we get 30. Therefore, if they were not to trade, everybody in America, combined with everybody in China, would only, as collective two countries, be able to consume 30 units of wheat and 30 cars. Okay? That's it. There's no trade, but the total world, everybody in America only has, and China, only collectively has together 30 of each. China has to consume 10 and 25, America has to consume 20 and 5, but still, those two separate nations combined, people in those countries can only consume 30 of each. Okay, now, let's assume for a second that the USA says, do you know what? Our workers are going to specialize in wheat. And China, your workers specialize in car production. And then we should trade. Okay, so we'll do what we're best at, what we have an absolute advantage in. You do what you're best at and what you have an absolute advantage in, and then we'll trade. Okay. Well, let's think about this. So America said that they were going to produce wheat. So America produced 40 wheat and decided to produce no cars. And China decided to produce 0 wheat and produce all cars. Well, if China spent all its time producing cars, and I can go back here to all of this stuff, right? I don't want to really spend too much time, but I can. So if China spent all its time producing cars, it could produce 50. If America spent all its time producing wheat, it could produce 40. Okay? So that's what brings us not to these tables here, but to this table here. So let's say they trade. Well, previously, the entire Chinese and American countries together, everybody in those countries could only consume 30 bushels of wheat, and they could only consume 30 cars. But if we specialize and trade, what we then say is, well, America produces 40 because it's got an absolute advantage in wheat production, and China produces 50 cars because it's got an absolute advantage in car production. So if we add the total amount of wheat that was produced in the planet, that's 40 plus 80, which is 40. If we add the total amount of cars that are produced, that's 0 plus 50, which is 50. Both of these numbers, with specialization and trade, are greater than both of these numbers. Essentially, because we're specializing, each country is specializing in what they're best at and what they have an absolute advantage at producing, total world production has increased. Now remember what we said in the previous video, a greater allocation of the world's resources. America's sticking to the wheat production and China's sticking to the car production, and greater productive efficiency. Well, we can see evidence of both of those here as opposed to here. A master of all trades, a jack of none. A jack of all trades, a master of none. Do stick to what you're best at. Compare the two tables, and as a result of specialization, Total world production has increased for both goods. Now, if they start to trade, okay, and I don't want to repeat this, you can pause this as we go through, but if they start to trade, well, what happens, right? In order for the specialization, this greater production to benefit both countries, America may want to have some cars because they may want to get from A to B, and Chinese people may want to actually eat because they like to stay alive, so they should trade with each other, okay? And this is what we're saying, right? And what I am trying to say is this was here, it was in America, it was 20 units of wheat and 5 cars was produced and consumed before specialization and trade. In China, it was 10 units of wheat and 25 cars were both produced and consumed. Let's just say, what were we saying? We're doing a 1-for-1 here kind of thing, right? So let's say they kind of go half and half, if I remember, okay? USA's consumption after trade. Now, this is their production there. They're producing 40 units of wheat and 40 units of wheat and 0 cars. God, I nearly lost it there for a second. And this is China's production. But now, if they consume 25 units of wheat and they sell the extra 14 for 15 cars, the extra 15, for 15 cars, they sell it at a 1-to-1 ratio, they can consume here, even though they're producing there. Now, is this here better than what they had initially? So America sold 15 units of wheat for 15 cars. Right, well now they have 25 units of wheat, where before specialization and trade they only had 20. So the prices of wheat is going to fall now in America just because there's more available. Now that they have 15 cars, whereas beforehand they only had 5. So the prices of cars in America are going to fall. So because America produced 40, stuck with the thing that it had the absolute advantage in, and then traded with somebody else that produced the good that they had the absolute advantage in, they have a higher standard of living in both flipping goods. Both of them. Now let's analyse China. China made 50 cars and sold 15 of them to the United States for 15 bushels of wheat. Beforehand, the China only had 10 bushels of wheat, now it's got 15. Again, there would be a tendency of prices of wheat to fall in China and more consumed, a higher standard of living. Beforehand, China only had 25 cars, now it's got 35. Again, the price of cars would tend to fall, real GDP, real income would rise, and as such lower prices, and well, not as a result of real income, but as a result of increased production, and therefore Chinese consumers have a higher standard of living in wheat and a higher standard of living in terms of cars. They are consuming more of both goods than they were previously. This is the benefit to both the United States and China. How did this occur? America stuck with producing the thing that it was by far the best at. China stuck with producing the thing that it was by far the best at. By far the best at replaced with absolute advantage. America produced wheat because it had an absolute advantage in wheat. China produced cars because it had an absolute advantage in cars, and they traded with each other. They produced the thing that each of them were best at, which were different, and traded with each other. That is the secret of international trade. Okay, now, a couple of things. The standard of living definition, right, is the level of wealth, comfort, material goods and necessity goods available to a certain socio-economic class in a country. Basically, it's how much you can flip and well consume. If you can consume more, you don't have to, but if you can, you have a higher standard of living. Both countries become better off because specialization, according to absolute advantage, specialize in the thing, only produce the thing that you're best at producing, leads to a global reallocation of resources, where each good is produced by the most efficient, low-cost producers of that good. And the absolute advantage means produce the thing, you use up the less resources in making. That's what that means. I've said that, absolutely. That's what I've said. Again, forgive me for repeating myself. A country has an absolute advantage in the production of a good if they can produce the same amount of that good with fewer resources than any other country. Now, finally, production possibilities curve, fine. All we're saying is that shows the limits of production, and without trade, the limits of production define the limits of consumption. However, as we have already seen, forgive me because we're going on to the next one, as we have already seen, and I'm going to get out of this presentation and go back from the previous PPCs. If we look here, both countries with specialization in trade, America produces here, China produces here, but America consumes here and China consumes here. With specialization in trade, both countries have the potential to consume far greater with specialization in trade than they could being an isolated country that doesn't engage in trade, known as an autarky. Guys, thank you so much. I'm sure this video was horrifically long. I really hope this helps, and I very much hope to see you in the next video.